My mother spent the last 30 years of her life being called simple. Simple woman, simple house, simple life. That's what my husband's family called her. Behind smiles at every holiday table, in every backhanded compliment dressed up as kindness. They were wrong, and she knew they were wrong the whole time. She just waited 27 years to prove it, and she did it from inside a shoebox on a cassette tape after she was already gone. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why she waited, and you'll understand why I almost didn't listen to what she left me. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is my mother's name, Eleanor, and the fact that for as long as I had been married, my husband's family treated her like something to be tolerated rather than someone to respect. I need to start further back than the funeral, because you won't understand what that shoebox meant unless you understand what it took to survive 27 years of small, constant erosion. I grew up in a 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town. It was just the two of us. My mother worked long shifts, first at a diner, later at the elementary school cafeteria, eventually running the whole kitchen there for 11 years until she retired. She was quiet in a way that people mistook for simplicity. She kept her hair short and practical. She wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation for as long as I can remember. She never dated anyone seriously after my father left. Or that's what I believed for most of my life, that he left, because that's the story she gave me when I was 7 and never elaborated on again. When people asked about my father, she'd say, "He's not part of our story anymore," and that would be the end of it. When people asked about her life before me, she'd smile and say, "I did what needed doing," and change the subject so smoothly you almost didn't notice you'd been redirected. I married Richard when I was 26. His family was comfortable in a way mine had never been. His father, Gerald, had built a successful regional insurance agency, and his mother, Diane, ran their household and their social calendar like a small, exacting business. They were never outright cruel to me. They were polite, country club polite, the kind of polite that has a blade folded into it. And from the very first dinner I brought my mother to, I watched Diane decide what she was. "So what did you do before the school, Eleanor?" Diane had asked over a beautifully plated chicken dish the first Thanksgiving my mother came to their house. "A little of this, a little of that," my mother said, smiling, reaching for her water glass in a way that ended the conversation. Diane looked at Gerald, a small look, the kind married couples share when they've silently agreed on something. I saw it and understood it perfectly even then. They had decided my mother had no history worth asking about twice. It became a running undertone in our marriage. Not cruelty exactly, erasure. "How's your mom doing, still at the school?" Richard would ask in a tone that made it sound like a punchline rather than a question. At Christmas, Gerald would occasionally raise a glass to family, old and new, and somehow my mother's name never quite made it into the toast, like an oversight that kept happening by accident year after year. I want to be honest. I let it happen. For a long time, I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. My mother never seemed bothered by it, or she never let herself seem bothered by it, which I now understand were 2 very different things. I told myself that as long as she was invited to the table, that was enough. I was wrong about that, and it's one of the things I regret most. She died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in her sleep, in the same small house she lived in for over 30 years, the way she seemed to do most things, without asking anyone's permission, without making a scene, without giving anyone the chance to say goodbye properly. I found out from a neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who'd known her for 2 decades and called the ambulance when she noticed my mother hadn't collected her newspaper in 3 days. I remember standing in my kitchen listening to Mrs. Alvarez's voice shake on the phone and thinking absurdly that my mother would have hated dying in a way that inconvenienced anyone. The funeral was small. My mother didn't have a large circle. A few former co-workers from the school, Mrs. Alvarez, two women from a book club she'd quietly attended for years that I hadn't even known about. Richard's family came, dressed appropriately, offered condolences appropriately, and Diane brought a casserole for after, because that's what Diane does in the face of any emotion she doesn't know how to sit with. 3 days after the funeral, Richard and I drove out to clear the house. He brought flattened boxes and a hand truck and tucked into his jacket pocket a real estate agent's business card, already talking in the car about getting it listed before the market slows down for summer. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that objecting to Richard's practicality rarely accomplished anything except making him more practical, faster. There's really nothing valuable here, he said. You said, walking through her small living room an hour into the sorting, running a finger along a shelf lined with ceramic birds she'd collected from yard sales. We'll do an estate sale for the furniture, I think, and just toss the rest. No sense keeping boxes of whatever all this is. I didn't answer him. I had wandered into her bedroom, and I was standing in the doorway of her closet. A closet I realized, standing there, I had never once opened in 38 years of visiting this house. Not as a child, not as an adult. It had simply never occurred to me to look inside my mother's closet, the same way it had never occurred to me that there might be something in it worth looking for. That's where I found the shoebox, not fancy, an ordinary shoebox, the cardboard soft with age, wrapped twice in a plastic grocery bag and taped shut, pushed to the very back of the top shelf. Behind a stack of folded quilts I don't think she'd used in a decade, I sat down on the edge of her bed and opened it. Inside, a cassette tape, unmarked except for a strip of masking tape across the top, and in handwriting I recognized instantly as hers, small, careful, slightly slanted to the left, for her, not him. I sat there for a long moment just looking at those 4 words. There was no context, no explanation. Just an instruction, written at some point in the past, waiting for exactly this moment. I didn't tell Richard what it said. I slid it into my coat pocket, and when he called from the other room asking if I'd found anything worth keeping, I said, "Just some old photos," and left it at that. That was the first lie I ever told him about my mother. It would not be the last, and looking back, I don't regret a single one of them. We finished clearing the house that afternoon. Richard filled 3 boxes labeled Donate and 1 small box labeled Keep, which mostly contained photographs, and a jewelry box with nothing particularly valuable in it. At one point, near the end, he picked up an old radio cassette player from a closet shelf in the hallway, turned it over in his hands, and said, "This is definitely garbage. Nobody even has anything to play these tapes on anymore anyway," and set it in the donate pile without waiting for my opinion. I almost told him then. I almost said, "Wait, there's one tape I want to keep. Let me use that before you get rid of it." But something stopped me, some instinct that told me this wasn't information Richard had earned yet, whatever it turned out to be. That night, we went to Richard's parents' house for what Diane insisted on calling a small remembrance dinner. 6 days after burying my mother, and Diane wanted hors d'oeuvres and a seating chart. I sat through most of it in a kind of fog until Diane, refilling wine glasses, said, "Do you remember, Gerald, the time Eleanor showed up an hour late to the school fundraiser?" I always wondered if she just lost track of time, bless her, or if she genuinely didn't understand what an RSVP meant. A few people at the table laughed politely. Richard didn't correct her. He never did, Gerald added, swirling his wine. She always seemed a little lost to me, if I'm honest, like she was waiting for her real life to start, and it just never did. I sat there and said nothing, the way I had said nothing for 27 years of small comments just like that one. But that night, for the first time, the silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like a decision I was making on purpose. I was going to find out what was on that tape before I said another word to any of them. I didn't own a cassette player, and neither did anyone I knew well enough to ask without explaining why. I ended up driving 40 minutes out to a small electronics repair shop on the edge of the next town over, the kind of place with dusty radios in the window display and a bell that jingled crookedly over the door. The man behind the counter was maybe 70, with reading glasses pushed up into thinning white hair. I asked if he had anything that could play an old cassette. He disappeared into the back and came out with a boombox from what looked like the early 90s, sitting on a shelf marked "Not for Sale, Display Only." He must have seen something in my face because he said, "Go on and use the back room. Looks like you might want to hear this alone." And he left me there without asking a single question, which I was more grateful for than he probably realized. I pressed play with my hands actually shaking. There was a hiss of static, long enough that I wondered if the tape was blank, if I'd built this whole moment up around nothing. And then my mother's voice, younger, steadier, entirely unlike the soft, apologetic tone she used at every family dinner for the last 20 years of her life. If you're listening to this, I'm probably gone, and you've probably just spent the last few years hearing people call me nobody. I need you to know that isn't true. And I need you to understand why I let them believe it anyway. I stopped breathing. 27 years ago, you were still small. You wouldn't remember any of this. I worked for the Army as a cryptologic linguist. 4 years stationed overseas. Most of it work I still can't fully describe. Not on a tape, not to anyone, because some of it was never meant to be described at all. But I can tell you this much. There was an incident. A cover-up is the honest word for it. Decisions made above my level that got 2 young soldiers killed for reasons that were never made public. And when I refused to sign off on the official report because the official report was a lie, they discharged me. Quietly, efficiently, in a way designed so that my file would mean nothing to anyone who ever looked at it again. No rank listed, no recognition, a general discharge that reads on paper like I simply wasn't good enough to keep. The tape hissed. She continued, and her voice, for just a moment, cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard from her, not once, in 38 years. I came home with a folded flag I wasn't supposed to have and a set of documents I kept anyway, against direct instruction, because some part of me already knew that someday someone would need proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. I was told in very clear terms that speaking about any of this publicly would have consequences for my benefits, for people who'd served with me, possibly worse. I was 24 years old and terrified, and I had you to think about within the year, and fighting back felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. So I let your father's family, and yes, I know what they say about me. I've always known. Don't think for 1 second I didn't hear it. I let them decide I was a simple woman with no history worth mentioning. It was easier than the alternative. It was safer. But I never stopped keeping records. Everything I have is real. Everything is provable if anyone with the right authority ever bothered to look. I've hidden the proof somewhere safe, and I'm telling you where, because I think it's finally time. Not for my sake. I don't need vindication where I'm going. For yours. So that the next time someone calls you just like your mother as though that's an insult, you'll finally know exactly what that phrase is worth. She told me where a safety deposit box downtown under a name I didn't immediately recognize, her maiden name, paired with a service number I would later learn by heart. The tape ended a few seconds later, mid-breath, like she'd meant to say more, and either ran out of tape or ran out of courage. I sat in that repair shop's back room and cried harder than I had at her funeral for the better part of 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I didn't tell Richard, not that week, not the week after. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't purely strategic, though strategy was certainly part of it. For the first time since I had married into that family, I had something that was entirely, completely mine. Something they hadn't been permitted to shrink, dismiss, or turn into a punchline over dinner. I wasn't ready to hand it to them yet. I wanted to hold it a while longer, in private, the way you hold something fragile before you trust anyone else near it. For almost 3 weeks, I lived a quiet double life. I told Richard I was handling estate paperwork for my mother's small pension and her house sale, which was true enough not to feel like an outright lie. On my lunch breaks, I drove downtown to the bank and eventually gained access to the safety deposit box using my mother's old military identification card, a notarized copy of her death certificate, and I suspect a fair amount of patience from a branch manager who could tell I wasn't entirely steady. Inside the box, a sealed folder of documents that took my breath away a second time, after action reports with her own handwritten annotations in the margins. A photocopied internal memo, clearly not meant to have left the building it came from, outlining instructions to manage the narrative around the incident she described. 2 separate letters, both handwritten, both addressed to her, at an old post office box from men who had served alongside her, corroborating details of what she'd said on the tape, almost word for word. And wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom, a small velvet box containing a medal that had never officially been issued to her, because officially, on paper, she had never earned it. There was also a business card, the ink faded, the corners worn soft, a name, a rank, and beneath it, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I recognized the acronym only because I'd looked it up twice already that week. He had apparently been the officer who helped her file her original complaint all those years ago before everything went quiet. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot and called the number on the card, fully expecting it to be disconnected. It rang 3 times. A man answered. "Colonel Whitfield, retired," he said. "Who's calling?" I'm Eleanor Voss's daughter," I said, using her maiden name deliberately, the way the tape had taught me to. There was a long pause on the line. "Eleanor Voss," he repeated slowly, like he was turning the name over to check it was real. I wondered for years if anyone would ever call about her again. We talked for almost 40 minutes. He confirmed everything, the incident, the deaths, the cover-up, her refusal to sign, the quiet discharge engineered to bury the whole matter along with her career. He told me something the tape hadn't mentioned, something that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. That roughly 2 years earlier, the department had quietly opened a cold review process, specifically for discharge injustices from that era. A process that existed largely because of complaints exactly like my mother's, filed and buried decades before. Her case, he told me, had actually resurfaced in that review already, sitting in a queue, incomplete, missing only a living relative, willing to formally request that the record be corrected and closed out properly. She'd be owed back recognition, he said, possibly benefits adjustments for you as next of kin, and if the board agrees with the file, which having read it myself years ago, I believe they will, a posthumous award. I submitted the formal request that same week, under my legal name, Richard's last name, on purpose. I wanted his family to see in black and white whose daughter-in-law had made this happen. The weeks that followed felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. I went to dinners with Richard's family and sat through the same small comments about my mother's simple little life with an entirely new kind of patience, because now I knew something they didn't, and knowing it changed the shape of my silence completely. It stopped feeling like submission. It started feeling like waiting. Richard noticed something had shifted, even if he couldn't name it. "You've been quiet lately," he said one night over dinner at our own kitchen table. "Quieter than usual, I mean. Everything okay with the house stuff?" "Everything's fine," I told him. "I'm just handling things at my own pace." He let it go. That was one of the strange mercies of my marriage. Richard rarely pushed past the first layer of anything, including me. Diane, on the other hand, seemed to sense something too, in the particular way that women like Diane always sense a shift in hierarchy before they can articulate it. She started including my mother in conversation a little more, almost testing the water. "I do think Eleanor had a certain quiet dignity to her," she said once at a lunch the two of us had alone, which was itself unusual. I said nothing. I let her sentence hang there unanswered, the way I was learning my mother had let so many things hang unanswered for years. Richard's 40th birthday fell at the end of that same 2-month stretch, and Diane predictably insisted on hosting. 22 guests. The good china brought out from the cabinet that was otherwise permanently locked, a seating chart she'd emailed me twice to confirm. I knew going in that the confirmation email from the department could arrive any day. I checked my phone under the table more than once that evening, and Richard noticed and asked if I was expecting something important. I might be, I told him, and left it there. Dinner moved through its usual rhythms: Gerald's stories about the agency, Diane's carefully curated conversation topics, Richard's cousins comparing vacation plans, and then, somewhere around dessert, Diane raised her glass for a toast, and in the exact way I had somehow known she would, she circled back to my mother. "We were all so fond of Eleanor," she said, smiling in that particular way. She smiled when she was about to say something unkind, dressed up in warmth. "Simple woman, simple life. I always said Swanswad sight was like there wasn't much hidden depth there, God rest her, but she loved you all in her own small way." A few people around the table chuckled softly. Richard didn't stop her. He never did. That's when my phone buzzed in my lap. I didn't even need to open the email fully. The subject line said everything I'd been waiting 3 weeks to see. Formal notification, posthumous correction of service record. Voss, Eleanor M. I stood up. "Diane," I said, "I actually have something to add to that toast." Richard looked at me like I had lost my mind. 14 years of marriage, and I had never once interrupted his mother at her own table. "My mother wasn't a simple woman," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "She was a cryptologic linguist who served 4 years overseas. She refused to sign off on a cover-up that got 2 soldiers killed, and for that she was quietly pushed out and silenced. She spent 27 years letting all of you believe she was nobody, because telling the truth would have cost her everything, including me. She kept every piece of proof anyway. I have all of it. And 2 hours ago, the United States Army formally corrected her discharge record and approved her, posthumously, for the Meritorious Service Medal she was denied 27 years ago. It will be presented to our family next month with full honors." Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long moment. Diane's wineglass stayed frozen halfway to her lips. Gerald was the first to find his voice. That's not possible. She was a cook. She was a cook for the last 11 years of her life," I said, "because it was quiet and it was safe and no one asked her hard questions there. Before that, she served her country and told the truth when telling the truth was dangerous. You called her lost. She was hiding. There's a difference, and I think, deep down, some of you may have suspected there was more to her than you let yourselves believe." Richard finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" I looked at him, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something other than tired exhaustion when I did. Because for 27 years, this family made it very clear there was no room at this table for a woman like her. I said I wanted to make sure there was room before I brought her back into it. The ceremony took place 5 weeks later in a modest auditorium on a nearby base. It was smaller than I expected and somehow more affecting for it. A folded flag, formally presented this time rather than kept in a drawer without permission. an officer reading a citation aloud that used phrases like integrity under sustained institutional pressure and moral courage in the face of professional retaliation. I invited Richard's family. I honestly wasn't certain anyone would come. Diane came. She sat in the second row in a dark blue dress, and she didn't say a single word through the entire ceremony. When the officer finally handed me the small case containing my mother's medal on her behalf, Diane was the one who started crying, first quietly into a folded tissue she'd clearly brought expecting to need it. Afterward, in the parking lot, she found me by my car. I used to think I understood people fairly well, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. I don't think I understood her at all, not for one single year. No, I said, none of you did. She let you not understand her because it was safer for her that way. I've decided I'm done doing the same thing. Richard stood a few feet away during that conversation, quieter than I had seen him in years. On the drive home, he finally said, I keep thinking about all the things I said about her, small things. I never thought they were cruel at the time. They weren't cruel, I told him. They were careless, which sometimes costs a person more than cruelty does, because at least cruelty gets noticed. He didn't have an answer for that, and for once I let the silence sit between us instead of rushing to fill it. I don't know if that one dinner or that one ceremony changed everything permanently. I'd be lying if I told you it did. Richard has been quieter since, more careful with his words, occasionally catching himself mid-sentence in a way he never used to. Diane still slips sometimes, out of old habit, and stops herself now before the sentence finishes. Gerald mentions my mother's service at family gatherings now, almost too eagerly, the way people do when they're trying to make up for something they can't quite name out loud. Old patterns don't dissolve over a single dinner or a single ceremony, no matter how dramatic the reveal. I've made my peace with that, but I know this much for certain. My mother spent almost 3 decades being underestimated by people who never once earned the right to underestimate her. She left me a cassette tape instead of an argument because somewhere along the way she had learned that proof outlasts opinion and that patience held long enough outlasts humiliation entirely. I still have the boombox from that repair shop. The old man wouldn't take money for letting me use it that first day, so I went back a week later and bought it outright, over his mild objection. It sits on my dresser now, beside a photograph I had framed. My mother in a uniform none of us ever got to see her wear while she was alive, standing straighter than I ever once saw her stand at any family dinner. Every so often, someone in this family still starts a sentence with, "Your mother was probably just," and catches themselves and stops. I let them finish it now, when they do finish it, and then I let the silence sit there afterward, exactly the way she taught me to all those years, without ever once explaining why.